Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment. We're going to be speaking with returning guest Dr. Jeff Stark. He's coming back with us from UCB to talk about some new data that was presented at the American College of Rheumatology Convergence 2021 virtual congress concerning Bimekizumab. Welcome back, Dr. Stark. How have you been?
I've been doing well, Neil. Hope you have as well. Thanks for the invitation to join you and your listeners once again.
Well, for those who aren't familiar with you as a contributor, give our listeners a little bit of your professional background and talk briefly about your role at UCB.
Thanks, Neil. I'd be happy to do that. So my name is Jeff Stark. I am the head of medical immunology for the U.S. at UCB. That means that I oversee our medical affairs teams, both our home office medical affairs team, as well as our field-based medical affairs team that many of your listeners may know as our medical science liaisons. Personally, I'm a rheumatologist, and so I get very excited about the opportunity to talk about data that we will discuss today.
Give us a little bit of an overview into that data. What was it concerning? Give us a bit of insight.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. So it was an exciting year at the 2021 ACR Convergence meeting that took place just a few weeks ago in November. At that meeting, UCB presented 11 abstracts, one of which was an oral presentation, the other 10 of which were e-posters. The meeting, of course, was a virtual meeting. And those abstracts extended really across our rheumatology clinical programs across several disease states, including psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, and non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis. Those data also extended across multiple molecules. So some of these data were focused on Bimekizumab, which is UCB's investigational IL-17A and IL-17F inhibitor, but also on CIMZIA or certolizumab pegol, which is UCB's TNF inhibitor. And overall, I would say that the data that UCB presented at this year's ACR Convergence meeting reflect our ongoing commitment to improving the care and outcomes for patients across the spondyloarthritis spectrum of disease.
Well, what were the results from the first 3-year study, Bimekizumab and ankylosing spondylitis? Talk a little about those implications, and then we'll talk about the other 3-year study as well.
Absolutely, Neil. So as your listeners know, Bimekizumab is an investigational molecule that UCB is currently studying in a large and robust clinical development program. And the data that were presented for Bimekizumab at the ACR Convergence meeting were focused on ankylosing spondylitis. As many of your listeners will also know, ankylosing spondylitis is a painful, chronic, inflammatory rheumatic disease that often affects people very early in their life, typically in young adulthood. And the results from the 3-year Bimekizumab data in ankylosing spondylitis from the BE AGILE study, which was a phase 2b study, showed how the long-term safety profile of Bimekizumab in patients with ankylosing spondylitis was in line with previous observations, meaning that we saw no new safety events over that longer-term period of observation, but rather events that were consistent with what had been demonstrated for Bimekizumab previously. But perhaps also equally important that the clinical outcomes and the efficacy seen in that study over a 3-year period were maintained and consistent over that period of time. So these data, we feel, really support that the selective inhibition of not only IL-17A, but also IL-17F in the treatment of ankylosing spondylitis helped to demonstrate the potential of Bimekizumab to provide not only short-term, but also durable clinical responses over a 3-year period for people living with this severe and chronic disease.
Were the results similarly positive in the CIMZIA study?
Yeah, so we had the pleasure of presenting, again, not only data for Bimekizumab, but also data for CIMZIA. And I think perhaps the most exciting of those data were the results from the C-EXPAND pivotal phase 3 study. C-EXPAND was the study that led to an indication for CIMZIA for the treatment of non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis. And at the ACR Convergence meeting, we had the opportunity to present long-term outcomes from that study, both for efficacy and safety. As a reminder, Synzia is the first and only FDA-approved TNF inhibitor for adults with active non-radiographic AxSpA and objective signs of inflammation. Non-radiographic AxSpA, although sometimes incorrectly perceived as a milder disease than AS, actually has been shown to affect patients similarly with a similar disease burden that can result in painful and debilitating inflammatory low back pain, loss of sleep, impaired mobility. And one of the greatest challenges of non-radiographic AxSpA is that even today, it often goes undiagnosed for 5 to 8 years from the onset of symptoms for these patients. So UCB shared the very first release of the 3-year results from the CEXPAND study, looking at the long-term safety and efficacy of CIMZIA in non-radiographic AxSpA. And here we were very pleased to see that the analysis reported safety and clinical outcomes in non-radiographic AxSpA patients that were consistent and durable over time. Moreover, we saw here, again, no new safety signals over a long period of treatment for these patients receiving CIMZIA for non-radiographic AxSpA. So some helpful data that can give clinicians some guidance as to what to expect from CIMZIA when used over a longer period of time for the treatment of non-radiographic AxSpA.
Now, some of our listeners may be a little more familiar with psoriatic arthritis. Is Bimekizumab also being investigated to treat psoriatic arthritis and other conditions?
Yeah, so thanks, Neil, for asking about the Bimekizumab clinical program. We are looking at the molecule across a variety of conditions, and in fact, the Bimekizumab clinical program is the largest program undertaken simultaneously across 5 potential indications at UCB. We are investigating Bimekizumab absolutely in psoriatic arthritis, as you mentioned, but also in axial spondyloarthritis, including both ankylosing spondylitis as well as non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis, the other component of that disease state spectrum that I just mentioned. Actually, even though we presented data about Bimekizumab at the ACR Convergence meeting, there have been even more recent releases of data from the phase 3 program or announcements of results from that program across the rheumatology space. And so the most recent of those actually was just on December 16th, where UCB announced top-line results from the phase 3 BE study. The Bimobile 2 study actually evaluated the efficacy and safety of Bimekizumab in the treatment of patients with ankylosing spondylitis. And so this was a phase 3 study. The results we were very pleased to share from the top-line interim analysis showed that trial met the primary endpoint, which was a very stringent endpoint of ASAS-40. And met all of its ranked secondary endpoints as well. So ASAS-40, in contrast to the traditional ASAS-20, is a higher threshold of clinical improvement. It measures improvements in multiple disease domains across areas like patient global assessment, spinal pain, physical function, and inflammation. And so we were very happy to see a very stringent endpoint met at a relatively early time point, which was just week 16. In addition to the Bimobile 2 study reporting out positive results for ankylosing spondylitis, we also were happy to recently announce top-line interim results for BE AGILE. BE AGILE is a phase 3 study in adults with active psoriatic arthritis, another phase 3 study from the Bimekizumab program, but one that looked at active psoriatic arthritis. We were very happy to see in that study that Bimekizumab met the primary endpoint of ACR 50 as well as all of the ranked secondary endpoints. And once again, here UCB has chosen a primary endpoint that goes beyond the usual endpoint. Typically ACR 20 is looked at in psoriatic arthritis clinical trials, but instead UCB established a more stringent endpoint of ACR 50. So we're excited about these programs across the spondyloarthritis spectrum and look forward to sharing more data with the community over time as those continue to become available.
Well, if you would, give us a website where we can learn more about UCB and follow any links that are relevant to today's information.
Absolutely, Neil. So anyone who's interested in knowing more about the work that UCB is doing in this area can find announcements related to that work as well as links to our pipeline at www.ucb-usa.com.
Great, great. Always a pleasure, Jeff. Thank you so much for returning. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having me, Neil, and hope you and your listeners have a great day.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, with returning guest Dr. Jeff Stark, joining us from UCB. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.